Hello, viewers and tech enthusiasts. Whether you are a developer, an M365, Intune, or Azure administrator working in endpoint management, or you are an architect, this presentation, which is fully packed with resources and information, will get you cruising into a kickstart to the Microsoft Graph API. So, on board here with me. Today, I'll be walking you through an overview of the Graph API, what it holds for developers, Intune, and Azure admins, and rich resources to get you started and working with the Graph API.
I am Sucheta, the creator of this session, which I am presenting as part of Azure Back to School 2023. Listed on the slide are a couple links where you can explore more about Azure Back to School. Here is some info about myself. I am a passionate techie and IT manager. I'm certified in several Microsoft Azure areas. I am an Azure and endpoint management enthusiast, and I find great joy in learning and sharing my knowledge as part of the Microsoft community. I'm reachable on Twitter and LinkedIn if you would like to connect and collaborate on Microsoft technology topics. So, what will you learn here? At the end of this session, you will gain knowledge about the capabilities of Graph, get a deeper understanding of the API, and comprehend what it is and what it does. This presentation will help M365 administrators, IT sysadmins, developers, and architects to get started and explore M365 capabilities with the Graph API. Learning about the Graph API will jumpstart developers and operations folks with the necessary skills and knowledge to manage, leverage, and use Graph. When you're done watching this session, you'll know where to get started with working with Graph. Let's start with what Graph is. Graph is a REST API that you can use to connect to and interact with data in Microsoft 365 suite of services, that is Office 365, Enterprise Mobility and Security, and Windows 10, Windows 11 family of services. All datasets exposed out of these are exposed through the Graph API. The Graph API at its core is a query language for data in M365. Typical Graph API queries include getting a list of teams that a user has joined, or something like creating a new user in Azure AD, which is now called Entra ID. Graph provides developers and Azure admins access to data located in various M365 services without having to learn about how the individual services work. You can use Graph API requests to start developing or enhancing your applications with M365 data. Also, custom applications can use the Graph API to connect to data. Now, how does the Graph API help? Prior to Graph, there were many disconnected cloud services. Authentication was inconsistent. Developers had to learn different APIs, SDKs, and there were conflicting data formats, JSON, XML, binary, to name a few. Graph is the single API to connect your apps to M365 data and services. Now we have one endpoint, one identity provider, and an industry standard data format. Graph was created to solve fundamental problems that developers faced. Applications had to be rebuilt for each customer environment. Previous API endpoints only worked for one specific user or tenant and resulted in applications that had a complicated user interface or awkward configuration steps just to get it running. The other problem was lack of a unified authentication authorization model for all Office users, consumer or commercial. Again, requiring developers to build two versions of their applications to serve each of those populations. Inconsistency in the format of the data returned and the resulting difficulty in correlating that data across workloads was the third problem. The Graph API includes APIs from SharePoint, Exchange, and Outlook, all accessed through a single endpoint. As an example, for Exchange Online, Email and Calendar has its own API, which is outlook.office.com. OneDrive for Business would have its own API. All different services had their own APIs or endpoints. Without Graph, your app would need to know how to talk to many different APIs, each with their own requirements, authentication, syntax, and outputs, which was not ideal. We did not want things that interacted differently. With Graph, we have one API that everything is moving to. There is this shift to one API to rule them all. With Graph, things are interconnected, which greatly helps. What is the unified Graph endpoint? Graph.microsoft.com is the API that offers a single endpoint and provides access to rich people-centric data and insights into the Microsoft Cloud. The power of Graph lies in easy navigation of entities and relationships across different services exposed on a single Graph REST endpoint. Once you know the basic syntax of Graph API requests, you can transfer that knowledge to access all entities available in Graph. And because all entities are available through the same endpoint, there is no need for a discovery service. Whether it is mail or calendar coming from Outlook, or whether it is OneNote, you can access all this through the unified endpoint at graph.microsoft.com. As you can see listed here on the slide are the differences between legacy APIs and the Graph API. The legacy APIs were all distinct, whereas Graph brings it all together to a single endpoint. So, which services does Graph expose? You can use REST APIs or SDKs to access the endpoint and build apps that support M365 scenarios because Graph exposes M365 core services such as bookings and calendar. It also exposes data from enterprise mobility and security services, which includes Entra ID and Intune. So querying through the Graph API helps Azure and Intune administrators to obtain or manipulate data that they would not otherwise be able to do via the portals. Intune administrators can also query for Windows services, including users' Windows devices. In addition, Graph provides access to Dynamics 365 Business Central services. Now, one more way of looking at what Microsoft Graph has to offer is by looking at the resources and type of data that it exposes. Let's explore what resources and data can be accessed with Graph. Graph services are based on users and groups. Graph gives us the ability to access and manipulate resources such as devices, tasks, file, mail, and conversations of a single user or a user group. Security is a critical part of any organization, and Graph provides that built-in security to control access to services. What can you do with the data or Microsoft Graph in general and the data accessed? Let's look at examples of the usage of Graph in context of how developers can leverage it and how Azure or Intune admins can leverage the API. Firstly, speaking of development scenarios, developers can retrieve users' information such as chat, files, calendar, and meetings and pull that into apps that users work with every day. They can use the API to build apps that access, analyze, and augment data from M365. The API can be used for building user interactive apps such as websites, Outlook, SharePoint, or OneDrive. Other examples of apps that developers use Graph with are automation processes with no UI, such as services or background processes. A real-world example of putting Graph to use in a development scenario would be developing an app that can get the history of interactions between salespeople and customers, review files related to the customer, and do much more to enable salespeople to work with customers more effectively. Yet another example is developing an app that scans users' calendar and suggests the best times for the next team meeting. If the developers didn't use Graph, they would need to learn and use the different APIs for Outlook, OneDrive, SharePoint to develop such apps. And on the other hand, speaking of Azure and Intune admins, they can use Graph to implement automation using scripts. Azure admins can pull data on users, devices, groups, and apps and utilize it for reporting purposes and for better management and control of their environments. A real-life example would be to retrieve a list of devices for all users in a particular Azure user group using PowerShell, which in turn calls the Graph API. Now, moving on to the real question here. Where can one get started with Graph? You can explore the Graph API at graph.microsoft.com. This link hosts the documentation listing all information on how to get started. Remember, this API can talk to everything, all of the services, Teams, Intune, Entra ID, Outlook, Exchange Online, to name a few. There is an SDK available for various languages, and there also exists a PowerShell meta module that goes through the SDK and talks to Graph. Next, we dive into the Graph Explorer, which is another very important element of Graph. Get your hands on it at aka.ms/ge. Graph Explorer is a tool to interact with the API. It is a great place to get started and see all the things that are part of the API. It gives you examples of requests that are available. It has links to the direct documentation. There are popular getting started queries available for reference. Graph Explorer teaches you the correct syntax and how the service presents data. The Explorer is a website you can go to practice calling into Microsoft Graph APIs. See what Graph APIs are available. Use it to try Graph APIs on the default sample tenant to explore capabilities, or you could sign into your tenant and use it as a prototyping tool to fulfill your app scenarios. Here I have listed a few additional relevant resources for developers, which should boost your exploration of Graph. Check out the Microsoft Graph Toolkit on Microsoft Learn as well as GitHub. The Graph Toolkit is a set of web components and authentication providers to connect your web app to Graph and load data from M365. The toolkit makes it easy for you to use Graph in your application. It is great for developers of all experience levels that want to develop an app that connects to and accesses data from Graph. That is, applications such as a web app or a Microsoft Teams tab. Then we have Graph tutorials. These tutorials provide step-by-step training exercises that guide you through creating an application that accesses data through Graph. Tutorials, sample code, and quick starts are available for various languages and programs or platforms. Lastly, we have the free developer tenant that is available. You don't need to wait to get started with building great solutions. Sign up for the free M365 developer program using a personal Microsoft account or an organizational account and get an instant sandbox to develop in. Check out the free developer tenant at aka.ms/M365devprogram. On this slide, I have quick start guidelines for admins to use Graph with PowerShell. Now, all that we can do in Graph Explorer is what we can do from PowerShell. We can call the RESTful interface from PowerShell to run commandlets and scripts to retrieve and manipulate data pertaining to users, groups, devices, apps from Azure or Intune. PowerShell provides access to all Graph APIs. It is open source and cross-platform and supports modern auth. The link at the bottom of the slide provides more info on running PowerShell commandlets from Graph. Let's review how you as an Azure admin can get started with PowerShell for Graph. You'll first need to install the Graph modules. The Graph PowerShell SDK has more than 40 modules that you can install and use. You probably don't need them all, since all modules combined together are a large download size. Install the authentication module first, then get additional modules as needed. Next, we connect to Graph using defined scopes. Graph is an application that performs things that we delegate to it to do on our behalf. We have to consent and say it can actually have that permission. We need to ensure our token has the right permission by setting the scope. Whether you need read-write permissions on users, groups, devices, and so on. Next step would be to request for and provide access to do what you're trying to do with running commands. Then we can change the profile to beta if we'd like to leverage non-production features of Graph. Version 1.0 is the production use case profile with limited production-ready features, while beta has the same resources as the version 1.0, plus it has previews. Beta returns all available properties on objects. If you're looking for a new capability, such as a cloud PC, you may find it in beta. Next, you may need to ensure app registration is in place. Once that is done, you can grab PowerShell code from Graph Explorer for various things that you may have tried in Explorer and use them, or you can write your own scripts. All of this put together should get you started with PowerShell for Graph. So to finish up here, let's see where you can go from here. Exploring and learning skills related to Graph or Azure in general should be beneficial to developers and IT operations folks. So keep up with the ever changing landscape of Microsoft technology platforms. Taking it further from this session, you could study for the MS 600 exam if it is applicable to you. Microsoft Learn has great content on the Building Apps with Graph Learning Path series to help you take a deeper dive into understanding and using Graph. All right, so that puts a wrap on my presentation. I believe you got a good head start into Graph with a walkthrough here. I hope my session was of help and that you enjoyed watching and learning as much as I have enjoyed putting this content together. I wish you the best of luck on your cloud journey. Thank you and happy learning.